I first lived in Korea from 1975 to 1977 as a Peace Corps volunteer. I find it very difficult to describe what Korea was like in those days because it has changed so much. The world has changed, but I think Korea in particular has changed a great deal. I was, as the others in my cohort were, about 30 of us, fresh out of university. I had been interested in joining the Peace Corps somewhere in Asia, and Korea was suggested to me, but I came with very little knowledge of Korea. Some of East Asia, certainly. I had studied in Hong Kong. Those 2 years in Korea were, for me, as I think for most of us who were Peace Corps volunteers, very tough years. For us as young adults, as young Americans in a very foreign place, and also because I think Korea was kind of tough for us. Why? Well, that gets to maybe trying to describe how I perceive Korea and some of my colleagues, young Americans, perceive Korea, because we had a very different experience, obviously, than if you were assigned to the embassy or the U.S. military. We did 10 weeks of intensive Korean language training in a provincial town in Korea, and then we all were scattered to the countryside, mostly, a few major cities, but mostly the countryside, to live and work for 2 years in Korean organizations. So I saw a Korea that I thought was a pretty tough place, not just because I was a foreigner. And what was tough about it? Well, the language was obviously tough for me. The living conditions were honestly quite challenging in a way that I hadn't expected. I had traveled in Southeast Asia, I lived in Hong Kong, but even in Seoul at that time, there was not a proper water system or sewage system or hot water or heat or air conditioning or things that we kind of take for granted now. And that was a little bit of a shock. So there was kind of the physical adjustments to a very different lifestyle, whether you're in Seoul, but especially in the countryside. But even more so to a culture that was not used to having foreigners in its midst, and a system that was still bore the traces, which actually I think we see in North Korea still, of a long history. Very, very hierarchical. This hasn't disappeared in Korea, but really hierarchical, really age-specific in terms of how you fit into that, and gender-specific and rank-specific and all the rest of it. So all of that was just a huge, intellectual and emotional challenge to deal with. But I guess you're not really asking me so much about my experience, but I guess it was so intense. You can say what's so memorable about it. It's not one moment, but just the day by day, the challenges of doing the simplest things. One of my early struggles when I moved to the town I lived in Chungcheong, a very conservative province in the southwest part of Korea, kind of in the middle of Korea, a county seat called Yesan, was laundry was still done in the rushing stream, or not so rushing stream, and very cold in the winter, by the way. I felt there were a lot of things I could do to adapt, and somehow washing my laundry in the stream was something I just found very difficult. But as a woman, I could not ask anybody else to do my laundry. So it seems like a very simple thing. But for me, it sort of stirred up, all kinds of questions and feelings about well, gender roles and expectations of me and what I was there to do and how much I could adapt, and introduced me also to kind of the Korean mindset about certain things. I mean, another example, and I'm giving you some, if you like, rather challenging and difficult examples. There's a lot of very positive things I'm going to say in a moment, but was in the schools where we taught. The way that things were taught, the way that discipline was carried out. I taught in a boys' middle school. Corporal punishment was frequent and often extremely harsh. This was not unique. This was widespread. It was very challenging to think about why that was happening. Obviously, Koreans, I'd already learned, dearly loved their children. Education was highly valued, but there was a brutality to the system you saw even at the middle school level in terms of the way in which discipline was enforced. So there were a lot of very challenging situations where I had to think through, my own place in the culture, but also try to understand it. The other thing, of course, about Korea during those 2 years was this was a place where, we talk about how rapid change is in the 21st century, but this was a place where even in a small, county town, maybe especially there, you could see change happening, maybe not day to day, but month to month. A town or a village that I might have visited, because I also traveled all around Korea doing workshops for teachers, and just because that was something to do, right? This is before internet and, being able to talk to people on the phone all the time, I traveled a lot by bus, by train, by bicycle, you name it, by walking, and I saw a lot of Korea. But I would go through towns and villages, especially in Chungcheong-namdo, and where I spent most of my time. And, 1 month, the corner store would not have a refrigerator, and the next month it would. And the next month there'd be milk, and then in the summer there'd be ice cream in it. 1 month, when I first arrived at my middle school, the only motorcycle among the faculty belonged to the principal. And the male teachers, a few of them had bicycles and everybody else walked. After a year or so, more and more people were getting motorcycles. There was still no private cars there. So these little things, TVs, they're not so little when the kind of food that people had, not only the ice cream or the milk or the things that were new to the Korean diet, but also the sense that things were gradually getting better, if you like. One thing that I remember very vividly in my school was one of our duties as teachers was to inspect the students' lunch boxes they brought every day, their toshirak. And if they brought pure white rice rather than mixed with barley, they were punished, and sometimes physically. That was because there were, and this gets to, the system in which I was this tiny, tiny, tiny little part, but the way the system impacted on people is something I saw. The edict had come from the government. We need to conserve or limit our consumption of white rice because it's so valuable. It wasn't for a health reason. Now everybody eats barley mixed with rice because it's healthier. And I used to tell people way back then it was, but people wanted their white rice. You couldn't make makgeolli with white rice. That was considered to be bad thing to do. So there was a sense of we have to change, we have to tighten our belts, we have to build our country, and the Seoul movement was part of that. I woke up every morning to, Seoul Undong song, Uri Himuro Manduse, our let's build our new village. So, those things were impressed me now. Then, they're memorable to me now because I've had the privilege of going back to Korea after, sort of decade after decade. And then seeing, for example, the Seoul movement, the new community movement, used as an example of how development in rural areas can be carried out. And I think there are some very positive lessons to learn from that. Some, perhaps not so applicable to other countries as to Korea, and also some lessons to be learned too. But those kinds of things. We had monthly civil defense drills at our school, and unlike today in Korea, even when in recent months there's been a growing last year there were growing tensions, but everyone took them very seriously, and in part because they were ordered to. And when we did have incidents of security issues, I was in Korea at the time that the incident took place at the DMZ, where the American soldiers were killed by the North Koreans wielding axes when they were supervising the tree cutting. It's interesting to me now that that's so memorialized. Then it was certainly a big incident, but you just kind of heard about it. And of course, information was very controlled. So you only heard certain things, and you knew you were only hearing certain things, but there was a great deal of tension, but you didn't know much more about it. So when Koreans said to me at that time, where we live like a frog in a well, I think they really kind of felt that way. They felt that way about the wider world. I didn't know anybody who'd ever been to the United States among the Koreans I knew. I knew no one who had a passport. But all those things, to get to, I guess, my final point about being in Korea as a Peace Corps volunteer, or maybe I'd say, well, a couple of other things, but all of that being the case, as I said, it kept changing. So, and partly Peace Corps volunteers teaching English, foreigners being out there was a part of, I think, both encouraging, if you like. I actually didn't need much encouragement, but trying to support these rising and huge expectations that Koreans had for their children, that things could get better. And certainly the government was promoting that. And there was a picture of Park Chung-hee in every office building in Korea and every school in Korea. And things could get better. So people remembered the war. People did not talk about political divisions, or if they did, they only whispered about them. But they were, feeling that we've got to try to just put the recent painful past behind us, to try to do what we can to have our kids have a better future. Education was a key to that. That's very traditional. That's one thing that hasn't changed. But there it really was. I'm going to make sure my child, if they can meet a foreigner, that's great. And someday, it wasn't even a point where they could think about studying in the U.S. or anything like that. But those are the kinds of generational expectations, I think, that just grew and grew over time. But I feel like I was at a point, and it wasn't just the 70s, it started in the 60s, but the 70s, it was kind of, reaching a little bit of liftoff. South Korea's GDP per capita, to the extent that's a useful measure, which is probably not a great extent, had only recently surpassed the North's. But there was a sense that notwithstanding what people clearly understood, I mean, people weren't stupid, it was an authoritarian structure, that things were beginning to move in a kind of a positive direction in terms of offering more opportunity for people. Peace Corps volunteers at that time in the mid-70s did not generally serve in universities, because the experience had been that in universities, the political unrest, was already, and of course this goes all the way back to, well, maybe the Chosun Dynasty, but certainly in the Republic of Korea to the student movement in 1960, bringing down Syngman Rhee. But there was a sense that in universities, frankly, Peace Corps volunteers got a little bit too tied up in the politics of things, almost inevitably. So we were out in the countryside, we were in middle schools, we were in health centers, we were trying to train or retrain, if you like, teachers of the Korean War generation or even the Japanese colonial generation who, for example, had taught Japanese. And then one day they were told, now you're teaching English. It's another foreign language, right? It was very tough for them. So you still saw people, the people who were older than me, the middle-aged teachers, the principals, the vice principals. I also got a glimpse of what that colonial Korea had been like, and there still were these vestiges of Japanese buildings, the Japanese-era buildings, which have mostly disappeared, of course, in South Korea now. So that sense of a history, although, again, the war was very little talked about, other than saying, and I think maybe as an American, there was people were just almost trained, although I think they really meant it, too, to say we are grateful to the Americans. But then they just wanted to look forward and see forward. But maybe this is my final point about 2 years. I can't pick out. I wasn't part of great events. This was clearly for me something that shaped my life and my profession and the way I deal with people, and sort of Korean culture and perseverance and world outlook had a big impact on that. Certainly a bigger impact on me than I think I had on any Koreans I met. But the other thing that I feel kind of happy now, especially looking back and seeing in Korea, even when it was kind of a gray, grim place. I certainly found Seoul, frankly, a little gray and grim. I grew to love the countryside because of the seasons, because of this love that Koreans had for their own natural surroundings, even when they were very unforgiving and stark. They were very beautiful, and there was this appreciation for that, and that was infectious to me, and I grew to love that. But the other part I really saw and grew to love in Korea was this extraordinary spark of kind of just creativity. That even in a sort of rather gray and grim, still I would call it almost post-war recovery period where people were so focused on economic development, just an enormous love of beauty and of art and of music and of trying to make the world you lived in just a little bit more attractive, in every sense. And that was a great lesson to me in sort of the discipline of gratitude, of enjoying life, and even when the circumstances can be very, very tough, not giving up. Yes, well, I returned to Korea as a young diplomat in 1983 after serving for 2 years in China, where we had only recently normalized relations. And I was in Korea as a Korean-speaking political officer from 1983 until 1989. So I saw on my second stay in Korea, this time a longer stay, a political and a democratic transformation which was at least as profound and as important as the economic transformation I had begun to see in the 1970s, and which of course continued. Yeah, I remember very well the students occupying the American Cultural Center, which is, I think it's an old Japanese bank building that's right next door to the Chosun Hotel in downtown Seoul. And the U.S. Embassy was where it still is in Gwanghwamun, a little distance away, and my office was there. But the Cultural Center had a library, as we used to have. Again, before the internet, people actually had to come in and look for books, and if they wanted to study in the U.S., kind of find the exam materials and research materials they needed. So we had a library there, and in those days we didn't have as much security as unfortunately we do now in most U.S. government and diplomatic buildings. I would say as background, well, this was not the first time that students had, if you like, targeted an American facility. The first time was actually in Busan a couple of years earlier, and that was a big shock. And this was a firebombing. I mean, firebombing sounds like a dramatic word, but it's several students going to the Gukjae-sijang in Busan, the market, and buying some buckets of kerosene or something, walking to the library, dumping them, lighting them on fire. It was a tragedy. I mean, people died. So that was a big shock, and we were certainly aware that, therefore, that we needed to be mindful that even though this was an anomaly, we needed to try to stay open, that these kinds of things could happen. And moreover, we were well aware, and of course part of my job was to make sure that my superiors, not only in Seoul but in Washington, were aware that South Korea was in political turmoil, that in particular university students, in a period of this is obviously under Chun Doo-hwan's administration after he took power in 1980. We're learning a lot of things, for example, about the Gwangju uprising, which put a lot of responsibility on American actions or inaction at that time. And so there was a burgeoning anti-American movement, I think it's fair to say. So in any event, this was not an isolated incident, if you like, although I would say that, generally speaking, the students were not violent. The Busan firebombing was a terrible tragedy, and I think it was a terrible thing they did, but I think it was unintentional. They weren't targeting people, but they were horribly, horribly irresponsible. In the case of the 1985 library incident, the students, I think it was about, my memory here is faulty, 7 or 8, maybe no more than a dozen students who kind of came into the library, which was open to them, it was for them. And once they were in, started taking books off the shelves. I have a friend who was in there at the time, and then unfurled a banner and dropped it out of the window. And the banner is something along the lines of, I think they had a couple of banners. So they'd had to hide them to because I think they probably went through some kind of little search coming in, not for political slogans, but, for security, were things like, down with the dictatorial regime, U.S. apologized for Gwangju, and so on. So there they were, and basically, once the students were there and unfurled this, they said, we are occupying the library, and everyone else should leave. So basically, they occupied the library. And what happened after that was, I was in the political section, so several of us in the political section, along with those our colleagues who worked in the library, and our ambassador kind of got together and thought about what the approach was. And the South Korean authorities were, somewhat understandably, very eager just to have this over with, for diplomatic facilities. And I think this cultural center qualifies as a diplomatic facility. The security there is a responsibility of the host government. So they were not happy that the security of the institution had been breached, but they also, I'm sure, were not happy about the political slogans that were being dropped down through the window. So we at the embassy, and again, I was, as you say, at a junior level there, but our ambassador and our political counselor, Harry Dunlop, who became the kind of the chief negotiator, said, let's talk to the students. Let's talk to the students and start a dialogue and see what their issues are, and if we can persuade them to leave. Yeah, but we're happy to talk to them. I mean, again, that was always our approach. We're happy to talk. Our ambassador didn't meet each and everybody, but I mean, all of us were out and about meeting with a lot of people. Our ambassador would have to make decisions, which I can understand, given my later experience, not so much in Korea, but elsewhere, that, you know, his prime, to digress on that for a minute, his prime objective had to be to make sure he had really good contacts and communication with the government, right? But also with other people in society. But there were other people in the embassy who did that too. So, for example, a lot of my job and my immediate boss's job was to keep in close touch not only with the students and labor movement and things like that, but also with some of the opposition politicians who sometimes were in jail, sometimes were in the U.S., sometimes were being lifted in political ban, Kim Young-sam, Kim Dae-jung, so on and so forth. So anyway, that's a lot of background. But talking to people was a fundamental principle for us. So we under the leadership of Harry Dunlop as kind of our chief negotiator, went over to the library, sat down with several of the students, and they had some demands, and they wanted to get those out to the press. And as I recall, the demands included that the U.S. should apologize for its perceived role in the Gwangju uprising, that they wanted to meet with the American ambassador. So there was kind of a personalized thing to it too. And I think some release of student prisoners. There may have been a few other things, but those were kind of the main ones that I recall. So actually over the course of several days, we had long discussions with them and went through our sense of what happened in Gwangju, why the U.S. did what. We have kind of an historical record on it. I'm sorry that Ambassador Gleistein is no longer with us, but he has an excellent book that he wrote about his perspective on that. But understandably, this was something that was all because it was all suppressed, if you like, with the consolidation of Chun Doo-hwan's power. There was room for lots and lots of misinformation. Some of it was probably true too, but a lot of exaggeration, a lot of distrust. So we talked about a lot of that for a couple of days, and eventually, the students did agree to leave, and we agreed that we would. It's very Korean and kind of very diplomatic. I think we kind of negotiate a little sort of agreed text, where our ambassador at that time, Ambassador Walker, would meet with students, but at something that we would kind of set up, and we would say to the authorities, the students came in here, we have talked with them, they've left peacefully, so we are not looking to see them punished. So that's what happened. The students did leave. They were arrested. I think some of them did serve some time, and some later went on to political careers. But that was that. And afterwards, our ambassador did meet with he had been, but some university students. But another thing that happened was I was asked to go to Seoul National University by the student group that had been the kind of main group behind the occupation. And the Seoul National University at that time had just moved to its out-of-town location a little while earlier. It may have been some years earlier. And I met with a group of students there. And I always remember, because it's the first time I think that my picture ever appeared in the Korean newspaper. Because again, it was very unusual, right? And I don't say this because my picture's in the paper, but Korean newspapers at that time didn't like to report, right, student demonstrations, except to say that they were violent, or they were, or they were, and they also didn't want to report some of the issues related to Gwangju. But this is sometimes, I guess, the role the U.S. has, because I went out there, I met with these students, they wanted the press there, they had them there, and the press felt, they published more or less an identical article, that this happened. And again, the students were much more interested in saying, we still want to meet with the ambassador. But we were able to have a conversation. That's what was so amazing about it, that it became as I said, the demonstration of the the businessmen in the suits, you know, coming out in Gwanghwamun. It wasn't just the students at Yonsei or the students at Koryo or wherever, you know, coming and having these kind of pitched battles with Molotov cocktails and pepper gas. It was people walking out Uchilo and Gwanghwamun and Namdaemun every evening, and quite, I think, happily, the regime acquiesced, and they had the election, and that was the point, you know, where there was no turning back. So obviously, Korean politics and Korean democracy has had a lot of challenges and ups and downs in the years going forward, but that was the not going back. And I give a lot of credit, obviously, not only, although that certainly to the people who literally, I mean, sacrificed and fought for human rights and for a democratic election, but also for a much broader swath of Korean society, including people, I said, who were in the government, who said, this is just not acceptable. This is not the Korea we want to be. This is not who we are. You know, we're a middle-class country, and even if we're not, we're Koreans, and we want to have the democracy that we've been promised since the establishment of the Republic. So you can see I get very emotional thinking about it even now. It gives me such inspiration, honestly, that out of a very unpromising situation, and in 1987, I think we were close, we don't know, we were close to perhaps martial law. It could have gone another direction, but it didn't. It didn't, and I think that, you know, we have to remember that sort of contribution, that sacrifice, and also that sense of what's possible.